And that would also give you the I would say, wisdom in understanding whether this is a real problem or is this a problem that has existed because of XYZ that can be resolved because of technology or because of the kind of things that you can build around it, right? So I would say that identifying the root cause of a problem is something that needs to come from the perspective of experience, right? And what you
Hi everyone, I'm Audrey. Welcome to another episode of the TheMiniCEO podcast. Today we are at Antler's office and we have Najla here. So Najla, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Firstly, thanks so much for having me, Audrey. So yes, I'm Najla. I'm the scouting director in Antler, Malaysia. So what does that mean, right? Scouting in Antler's perspective. We are always identifying great talent, great profiles to essentially build their startup under the Antler residency. So essentially my day-to-day operations really is about, interviewing founders, like how I did with Audrey before, as well as hunting for founders as well, right? Like, so not everyone knows that, wanting to break into the entrepreneurship path is for them. So I usually be the person that reaches out to some of these profiles we've, shortlisted and have, the discovery conversations with them. And hopefully I can also do a little bit of a fast track of that version here in this podcast.
That's cool. So let's talk about what kind of a founder you are looking for when you are scouting through it.
So there'll be a few things that we look for when identifying profiles, right? Like, so I'll share it like very transparently. We usually go through LinkedIn profiles, right? Because that's also the easiest way to want to filter out for candidates. I would say we look at it from the perspective of, are you a technical founder or are you a non-technical founder or profile, right? Because not everyone is coming in as a founder yet. We definitely want to understand from the skill sets that you have in your past, like previous roles, whether you've actually done regional kind of roles, have you actually been part of a team that has kickstarted initiatives, meaning like building from scratch or scaling out a particular business or a particular product before, right, in your respective capacity. Because effectively being a startup founder, you need to understand how to take things end to end, right? So from the whole concept of, hey, we're theorizing some idea, I can essentially execute for it, right? So regardless of whether you've been in a corporate environment or a startup environment, if you have exhibited any of these skill sets, and usually what we look for through these profiles would be those indicators, right? In terms of like your title, the roles that you've played, what kind of companies that you've worked with, it gives us a good first layer of indication, whether you have that 0 to 1 or like 1 to 10 kind of experience. So that's one thing. And I think I touched a little bit upon that, right? Having this regional exposure, because for a lot of founders, especially the kinds of founders that we're looking to back and support through Antler, you need to build a company that can be, if not a global player, regional from day one, right? Having that kind of vision, that kind of aspiration is very important, because building for just one market, a sole market, is not going to be big enough of an opportunity when you're building a startup, right? And so having the exposure in operating in different markets or interacting with different markets gives you that kind of sense of awareness, what it takes to launch something in multiple markets or like build out teams in different markets, right? Because these are real tests of challenges that you will face as a startup when you're even at the early stages of trying to understand how different markets would react, how you're validating specific like problem statements for different markets, right? So that's what we look for. And of course, lastly, a very key and important part of our assessment is, whether you are the kind of person who has grit and motivation. We all know building a startup is not easy.
It's not easy.
99% of the time, you'll be facing downsides as opposed to upsides. So whether you have the kind of tenacity to, just move with the motion, overcome these barriers, overcome depression even, right? Like as a founder, to sort of like see how you can cross over to the other side, because 95 to 99% of the time, it's you having to just deal with your own mental capacity of, hey, this is not working, this is not working. Okay, how do we then find ways to make it work, right?
Exactly.
So we need to really like stress test people's, I guess, like grit and perseverance through,
I understand.
like the conversation or the kind of stuff that they've done in the past, right? So I would say in a nutshell, that's what we look for.
I think 99% we get rejection as a founder. So I'm so over it now if I get a rejection.
You're becoming numb to the rejection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's a good thing, actually, I think, to move forward. Yeah.
So, I think like definitely you'd have to be comfortable with rejection in whatever form, right? Because even as a startup, let's just say even if you get invested, you will still face rejection. Part of sales is going through rejection, right? Like, so knowing how to navigate rejections, how you can use rejections as an opportunity, it's a skill. It's a skill and a muscle that you have to build, right? The whole thick face concept.
I think that's a good advice you give to the founders who are wanting to join Antler. But I wanted to dive a little bit on the beginning when you say you're screening through their LinkedIn profiles first, even for the non-technical, maybe their business or product managers, you screen them. What is the strong point that really stood out to you when you screen through it? Like, for example, is it years of experience, or what kind of projects that they done that showcase that, oh, you must have a call with them?
That's actually a very good question, and I feel like it's hard to want to just give like a black and white answer, right? Because with different profiles, also different things will stand out. And of course, at the end of the day, LinkedIn is written by the author themselves, right? Like, so of course we're going to maybe overemphasize certain things. We might be wording certain things to make our profile stand out and attractive, and it's not verifiable in a way, right? I mean, even with the endorsements that you get on LinkedIn, right? Let's face it, we all kind of like get our friends like, hey, can you just endorse me for the skill?
You can ask for it, like requests,
right?
Yes.
But I would say that it does act as a very good first layer to screen, like to have like top of funnel. And I would say definitely years of experience plays a role, right? Because at Antler, depth of experience is very important. It's not to say that, hey, if you're a fresh graduate, you're not capable of building a startup. I mean, we've definitely seen the rare exceptions, right? Like, for example, the founders of Stripe at the age of 19, they basically built out an amazing product that is widely used and widely loved, right? So it's not to say that those exceptions don't exist, but for most of the population, for the masses, you basically would be able to build out your muscle of understanding how businesses work through experience. And it's usually through professional experience you get that exposure. So we definitely do look at years of experience as a good first filter to be an indicator of, okay, this person has got wisdom in the way that they're approaching business. They might have like a more solid thought process. They also might have specific domain or functional expertise that they've built over the years, right? So that's what we look for, because that would be a test bed to see whether they understand how businesses work in reality, as opposed to just being an idealist, right? So that's one thing. The second aspect, like I said, right? So the way that we actually scout for founders is we will look at specific role, skill, keywords, right? That we know would usually be associated for what would make a good startup founder. So through that perspective, that would be another second indicator, right? Like of what sort of skill set or functionality that they are going to bring to the table as a founder, right? Like, so for example, if I am going to be someone who understands how to build tech products, of course, you want to look at what sort of roles that they've played and in what kind of companies also. It's not just a clear, straightforward, okay, I am named a senior product owner, that immediately that I would be a good product owner. Because sometimes in some companies, product owners are actually just another project manager. They don't actually get involved in the product building side of things, right? So having that kind of lens helps for us to also understand if they're coming from X company and they've actually been in a product role, they may or may not be the right product person, right, that we reach out to. So that's just an example from like a role title, skill set kind of assessment that we do. I would say maybe the third thing that we look for, and it touches on what I said earlier, right? Their exposure to working in broader markets. So sometimes it could be based on the roles that they've played. Like we can actually see that, right? They've actually held regional roles, or the kind of companies that they've been associated with, right? That we know that their operations tend to be a little bit more wider than just one market. So, those will be some of the key things that we look at when we look at a LinkedIn profile, right? So that helps us do very quick assessments of whether, hey, do I want to reach out and speak to this founder or not? But of course, for the clear-cut cases of, I need to speak to this founder or this profile, is when you've seen that they've actually been an entrepreneur themselves, right? I mean, of course, for a lot of folks, when they've actually done this seriously, they will definitely want to list this on to their LinkedIn profiles. And so those are the ones that we want to have a chat with, right? Because regardless of what they've built in the past, right? Even if they say it's not really aligned to the kind of business that Antler invests in, but for the fact that they have tried it out as a founder, even fail, it means that they have that tendency of pushing through to take the risks and have big vision and dreams, right? So that's also a very important tell for us in terms of whether this is going to be the right profile. Because sometimes they might be great in terms of a CV, right?
Yeah.
Great years of experience, have built depth in a specific functionality or domain. They've held regional roles, but ultimately they're just comfortable, right? In terms of being in as an employee. So how do you discern, right, between these types of people versus someone who might actually have the inclination to build for themselves, right? Of course, we can't isolate everyone at the beginning through paper, but when you see that they've actually had attempts at entrepreneurship in their prior life, then that's a very good indicator for us, right?
I think I wanted to share my experience because my LinkedIn profile before I joined Antler is all very corporate job type and things like that. But I think because I get to know about Antler through Tech in Asia last year, and one founder talked to Jinyi, and then he actually shared with me Jinyi's name card and, hey, you should contact Jinyi and try to get through this program. And at that time, actually, I have built something myself. It's actually a food recipe website that I don't think it's scalable right now. But yeah, and I went through the interview. So I wanted to ask, how does Antler, so after you screen through the person profile, what are the next steps to get into the program?
Yeah. So even with us at Antler, we face rejections too, right? I mean, we have to walk the talk. So even with these people that we outreach to, not every one of them is going to be interested. So that's also another indicator, right? Whether they have a propensity to jump into entrepreneurship or not. But for the ones who are interested, we will have sort of a conversation with them first. So as much as it is us trying to suss them out in this conversation, which is just an introductory conversation, it is also kind of like selling a dream to these founders to also take the leap, right? Because usually the ones who are interested to have a chat with us, it's for either one of two agendas. One is they might be just curious, they want to understand how they can leverage this relationship, right? But the second, which is obviously the more interesting conversation or agenda, is they know that deep inside they've always wanted to jump into building something of their own, but they're a bit unsure. They don't know how to start. They don't know what is this Antler residency.
That was me.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so this becomes a really good opportunity for me to sell the vision to them and how Antler is making this possible for them, right? And then through that conversation, it's for me to provide them as much information so that it helps them make a decision for themselves. Because jumping into entrepreneurship is not something that you just think about overnight.
No.
Right? It is really a high risk consideration.
It took me 10 years actually.
Right? And for a lot of people, that is the kind of transitionary journey they have to go through to really make that leap. I mean, even for me, after I left my first job, I went into entrepreneurship. I was a startup founder myself. It was after 6.5 years, right? And because at that point in time, I didn't even know what is it that I was looking for. And it almost was a happenstance that I actually went into entrepreneurship because I knew that I didn't want to go through a very vanilla kind of professional path. But yeah, it takes time. So that's my opportunity of giving them as much intel that they need to make that decision. And then of course, if they are really interested, then essentially it's them to apply on our website, right? So we do have a formal application process where that's where we do the whole assessment, we interview them. It is a rigorous process. Like some people would probably feel like, oh my God, why is this like a job interview when this is not a job? But this is also for us to filter out quality, right? And quality here has many different dimensions. It's not just about what you can bring to the table as a founder, but it's also what sort of mindset, what sort of attitude are you bringing to the table as well.
Okay. Yeah. Let's say you have screened through them, and what if they don't have an idea, or maybe they have a very solid idea and they joined the Antler program? How would you describe the founder problem fit or founder idea fit? Yeah. Can you describe more on that?
Sure. So let's separate the two categories, right? Like the people who are coming with a specific idea in mind already versus the people who are still exploring different ideas to validate. So on the first category, when they're coming in with a fixed idea, you know that they have probably put in a lot of more effort into it, a lot more time into it, and it's probably like them married to the idea in itself. So during the interview process, we're not just assessing the founder as a profile, we're also then assessing their idea. Because the reason why we do this is there's no point bringing a founder in if they're married to an idea and we already know that that's not an investable idea. It's not a scalable idea. So we don't want to waste the candidate's time, right? Like bringing them in while all the while knowing that they're not going to detach themselves from the idea. So we will then assess it from the perspective of, is this solving a real problem or is this just a superficial problem? Secondly, is there a founder idea fit? Meaning, are you the right person to be building in this space? An example that I can give to you is someone who has built their career working in e-commerce, and then all of a sudden they want to come out and build a health tech startup. I mean, will you trust someone who actually has never been in this domain or industry before to want to build something that's very, very complex in terms of the relationships that exist within the healthcare industry, and not knowing exactly who might be the stakeholders that are involved in this industry as well, right? Like there's no fit there. So we will look at it from that perspective. And then of course, lastly, we'll look at it from, is this a scalable kind of business model that you're even thinking about building, right? Because not everything has the kind of hyperscale growth potential, because some models are just very traditional in the way that it's being done. And of course for us, because we've seen so many different types of startups, we've seen what has gone well and what has failed as well. And we know why a lot of these companies fail, right? Like that's also part of our job, right? To really understand how different startups have attempted, at what point in time, what inflection points were there. And from that kind of knowledge and awareness is also the lens that we're applying when we're assessing the idea that the founder wants to bring to the table, right? Yeah.
For the founder who doesn't have any idea, they still are qualified to join, of course, if they are experience everything, showcase that they have the grade and all that stuff. How do they look for a problem? Because when I was going through the first 4 weeks and joining all the boot camps, pitching in every boot camps, I think the toughest time we have is actually finding a problem to solve.
Yeah, it's not easy. So this is what a lot of people get confused with, right? They always would say, hey, I have so many different ideas. A lot of times when someone says that they have like really great ideas, they have like maybe a book with like hundreds of ideas in mind, it's usually coming from the perspective of, hey, I think having this cool tool, having this cool app would make this easy for X, would make this convenient for X. So it's very much driven by like the solution angle of it, but not thinking about, is this really a need? Is this really a pain point for people, right? So that's actually why a lot of people think that, no, I think it's easy to come up with ideas because I always have like brilliant ideas in mind. But to actually come up with an idea where it is grounded on the fact that this is a real problem to solve is not as easy. And that's also another reason why we look at people who have experience. Because it's only through your experiences in a professional capacity or not that you'd be able to identify what gaps exist within that particular space, right? And that would also give you the I would say wisdom in understanding whether this is a real problem or is this a problem that has existed because of XYZ that can be resolved because of technology or because of the kind of things that you can build around it, right? So I would say that identifying the root cause of a problem is something that needs to come from the perspective of experience, right? And what you can then validate with people, right? And then of course, like for a lot of people, the other misstep here when they say they have great ideas and you know, they've already like spoken to people and everyone says that they like something like this, it is also very much on a biased perspective, right? Because it also depends on what you're asking the potential ICPs, right?
Exactly.
If you're asking them, a leading question, obviously they're going to tell you something that you want to hear, right? But if you're properly validating the problem statement, validating the idea in itself, then you will figure out whether this is something that people actually would pay for or it's just like another convenience tool that I don't really need. Yeah.
So for these identifying problems, right? Besides because you can gratify through that problem and solving the real world problem, does it also means it's easier to pivot with the solution? So for example, when you come up with a problem to solve, you also will come up, second stage is to come up with a solution, right? So what does it mean by you can change the solution but not the problem or something like that? That's what I recall when I was going through it.
Yeah. So problems are there for a reason, right? And the moment you actually identify a strong, real pain point, whatever industry that it may be that you're pursuing, the problem will always exist, right? And it's not to say that because the problem exists, it means that no one has tried to solve it. In most cases, there must be other companies or startup that's already trying to address it, but in different means. But for the fact that the problem still exists, it could just mean that the way that the different solutions that's out there is not catering to the entire market, right? Competition means two things, right? Like one is that there is a real need that exists, right? In people building a particular solution for that space. And secondly, it also means that not everyone within that landscape is being addressed. That's also what it means to have different segments of that market, right? And also what it means to say the market share is big enough for multiple startups, multiple companies to play in that space. I mean, that's also why if you look at like the fintech space, the payment space, there are so many different players, right? Like it's actually become quite a red ocean. So in terms of the solution, right? Again, like what I mentioned, the problem will always be the same basis. The fundamental of it is still going to stay. But the way that you're addressing it will just get more and more efficient over time, right? With the way that technology is also evolving, is giving the opportunity for incumbents as well as new startups to come and solve the problem in a better way, in a more cost-effective way, in a faster way as well, right? So that's why solutions can always be pivoted, if you know what I mean. Because it's just the method of achieving an outcome for that problem, right? That's why we always say that never fall in love truly with the solution that you're building, because it also depends, right? There could be a lot of external factors that comes into play that would just make the way that you've built out your solution to be obsolete in, let's just say, 2-3 years, right? So that's why products are always iterated. If you look at all of like the big companies as well, right? They're constantly, improving their products, because it just means that there's new technology, there's like consumer behavior is changing. So the way that you're approaching things has to evolve as the market's also growing.
That is a very good explanation. I purposely want you to get that out from you because you explain it better. And I think I learned that a lot from throughout the boot camps, because there's founder idea fit, like you mentioned earlier, and then there's also problem solution fit, which we already talked about. That's great. Because why I want to mention these two parts is because everyone out there, maybe in LinkedIn posts or anything like that, people just talk about product market fit. And that is the most famous that we know
term
of.
that you hear.
Yes, exactly. But no one really talks about founder idea fit or problem solution fit. So that's really great. I wanted to talk about market share. Like just now you mentioned that. For market share, how big of a market size do you think founders should capture? Is there like a benchmark, or how do you actually gauge the market size besides ChatGPT top-down approach?
Okay, so I guess this is also something that a lot of people will commonly hear, right? When they're looking at the market opportunity or market size, the TAM SAM song, the very infamous TAM SAM song. There's not going to be a hard and fast rule as to what would be the ideal market size, because it just depends on what kind of sector that you're in. It depends what kind of markets that you're looking at, that your TAM SAM SOM is going to change, right? But I would say typically your TAM and your SAM is driven more by an outside-in perspective. So it means it's very top-down. There'll be, analysis, research reports that tell you how big the actual pie looks like from like a global perspective, and then you narrow it down, right? Like depending on what your TAM is, and then you narrow down your SAM to maybe specific segments or specific geographies that you're focusing on as the opportunity that exists from a how do you say it, like holistic perspective. But your SOM is where you have to think about it more from like a realistic standpoint, and that's what we call also the bottom-up approach. So you basically calculate it on the fact that, okay, if I'm going to build this particular product, what would be the kind of pricing that I'm going to be introducing, and how many customers do I need to capture to attain X amount, right? So like, for example, a lot of VCs, we're always looking at SOMs of at least 100 million in revenue opportunity, right? And that would be like your 100 million capture for like the next 5 years. That's attainable. So if you actually use that as a benchmark, then you back calculate, right? Like to achieve 100 million in 5 years, what would my number of customers look like times the unit price of what I'm selling it for, right? And then effectively you will also then be able to gauge what is this of a percentage of my SAM, TAM, right? Because if you actually come to like a VC and you say that, oh, my SOM is essentially 35% of the market, everyone's going to be like, okay, I think you really are out of touch with understanding this market, meaning you don't even understand what is this market like, who are the competitors within the space. So the usual gauge of what's reasonable is where you can attain between 5 to maximum 10% of the market share, right? Like that's usually what we see in terms of the average sort of like newbie coming into the market and acquiring market share, right? Of course, eventually, it's not to say that you could never grow to capture maybe like 20, 25% of the market, but in most cases, like that's not the more realistic capture of market share. So that's the kind of indicators that we look at, right? So if you're going to take like 10% of this market, like what would that look like? So that's also one of the ways in which where we can gauge whether this is really a big enough of a market or is this too small of a market, right? And so that's also one of the conversations that we have through these boot camps that we run in the residency, the kind of feedback that we give to some of the founders, because sometimes the space that they want to build in is not a big enough space, right, for VCs to be interested in. It's not to say that the market doesn't exist at all, but it's just too small of a market for VCs to be excited about. So I would say, like, in terms of market share, it's really contextual. Depends on what space that you want to build in. But the calculation is where you need to triangulate between the top down and the bottom up right? So from this triangulation, you can assess, is this a realistic capture of the market, or is this really out of whack that I need to probably go back to the drawing board and identify my segments properly, identify the market properly.
Yeah, that's great. That's really a good idea that we have on how to build in the space that we want to build in, right? So coming to this, we have covered a few things that the founders should take note of if they are interested in Antler. But I wanted to talk more about the program itself.
Okay.
Like there's a span of 10 weeks and what will they go through during this 10 weeks?
Right. One short word, hell. No, I'm kidding. Yeah,
My word would be intense though.
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of both, right? Like we don't want to sugarcoat things, right? We don't want to say that, oh, this is going to be like the softest landing for people who want to take the leap into entrepreneurship. If I'm saying that, it's a lie, right? It's not easy because, again, entrepreneurship in itself is hard. And then couple that with the fact that you're working with someone who's potentially investing in you, it's definitely going to be a really crazy, intense, like what you said, right? Intense ride, because the pressure cooker environment will also act as like a weeding out of the people who don't necessarily have what it takes to build a VC backable startup, right? And so the reason why we're actually constructing the 10 weeks residency in such a way to be intense is not to just put people through hell, but it is really a way to measure whether these founders, these profiles have what it takes to overcome the real world, right? Which is when you start building and when you start selling and then when you're trying to actually move fast, right? Because if you don't have what it takes within this 10 weeks, most likely you won't have what it takes to actually move as fast as what VCs would expect for, performing startups to do. So the way in which that we built out this 10 weeks residency model is essentially to help founders through multiple things, right? Like one is finding the right co-founder. It's not to say that you can't find your own co-founders, because we have definitely accepted a lot of pre-existing teams into the residency program. And effectively, they are already having a team. They've already been validating their hypothesis. Now they're in the process of wanting to build out their product, but they basically need a little bit more validation and help from Antler to sort of like, I guess, filter down their thought process a little bit more, help them with identifying, like, am I actually going about the validation process right, et cetera, help with giving insights from what we've seen as well. But for majority of the folks that are coming in, they are looking for the right co-founders, because we're all ultimately limited by our first and second degree of network. It doesn't give us a lot of diversity in terms of exploring complementary skill sets within, our network, our social network. And then secondly, it's like you said earlier, right? The ideation part of it. While we come up with ideas left, right, and center, but whether these are real impactful ideas, big ideas, is a completely different conversation altogether. And so they're hoping to get that kind of stress test of their idea and then see how they can validate or even pivot at that point in time. And so especially in the first 3 weeks of the residency, we run these like 2-3 sprints of boot camps every week, where founders get to test out different ideas as well as explore different founder relationships in a very, very quick way. So then they can narrow down, right? Hey, Audrey, I think like you and me, we can really work well as founders because we've done like 2 boot camps now. And then I can see that we can gel. And then of course we do provide founders with toolkits, right? Like things in which that you need to cover as like potential co-founders before you commit to each other. Yeah. Like get all of the difficult questions out of the way at the outset, right? And then effectively working through these boot camps, because they are like very intense turnaround times. You also get to see how you work well under pressure, right? So that's one thing. And then at the same time with the ideas, because you are going through all these different rounds of different ideas and then you're getting shot down by the Antler team, it's making you think through and like maturing your thought process, right? In terms of how you should think about building a VC backable startup. And then of course, at the end of the day, we are a VC. We know what is a VC backed kind of idea and what is not. And we also know what it takes to build a hyper scalable type of business. So there's a lot of fundamentals that we want to set right from the founders, be it whether they're like first-time entrepreneurs or returning entrepreneurs. Setting this as like the clear baseline for everyone is going to help them with also overcoming their own mental blocks of when they think about ideas, but at the same time also making them see things from a completely different perspective. Like we want to have them go through that mindset shift, right? For some people, they don't think big enough. For some people, they think unrealistic enough, right? So everyone needs to have the same fundamentals, and that's what we do through our masterclasses. So these masterclasses cover many different types of topics, but all aimed at giving you the right solid foundation of what it takes to build a VC backable startup. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it is about community, right? So you can imagine every cohort has like 60 to 70 different profiles coming from so many different backgrounds, coming from so many different types of experiences. While there is diversity in that, everyone is aiming towards the same thing, which is I want to build the next unicorn. Right?
Exactly.
So you can imagine being in that kind of environment. It helps with persevering. It helps with the motivation as well. I mean,
it really pushes me out of my comfort zone. I've been working in the corporate for 8 to 10 years, and these intense boot camps and master classes really changed my perspective. Like, you were telling us that there's no solopreneur that should be building alone. They should always find a co-founder and to build together. And then you show us a chart of like usually there's the success rate of 2 co-founders is the highest, I think.
2 to 3,
2 to 3 was the highest, and then 4 is a bit lower but still okay. But 5 and above, I think it was very low because maybe there's some arguments between co-founders.
I mean, conflicts happen, right? Like regardless of the number of co-founders that you have within a team. But when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, you will definitely end up having the problem of, hey, we have the same skill sets. Why is it that you are CEO and I am just like, I don't know, a COO, right? Like, so you will end up having, how do you say, redundancy in terms of the skill sets that you need, especially in the early stages of a startup, right?
I think on that side is also very sensitive about splitting the shares. And a lot of people don't want to go for 4 co-founders because of the dilution of it. And I think it was in the beginning. So I met David through the boot camps, and then we just team up and track out together. So actually we were looking for 4 co-founders, and everyone was telling us that we are crazy. But we can foresee that our skill sets is very limited, like just 2 of us. He's technical, yes, but he's also an AI engineer. He cannot split into
doing full stack. And
we need a CTO. That's right, we bring in a CTO. We tried, and I was also looking for a business person, like a BD or enterprise BD, so that can help me close a sale, something like that. So people, but we know that going solo or going a small team is really take a toll on us as well as the split of workload.
I mean, definitely, again, right, it's going to have to be very contextual, depending on what you're building as well, is going to dictate what would be the optimal skill sets that you need to build up and then start selling, right? Because effectively at one point you would definitely like start growing and scaling, right? Especially when you've already had your initial first few customers, and then you realize, hey, we actually need more people to help speed up our product build, speed up with just serving more customers, right? But then you need to be able to discern between, do I need this person as a co-founder, or do I actually just bring this person in as an early employee, right? But then again, in terms of whether these are the core co-founders that's necessary to actually build and launch the startup, like you need to assess that as a team, right? As a whole. Because I'm not going to say that, no, for sure, like, for co-founding team is not going to work. I can't say that for a fact, right? Because it really needs to depend on what you're serving, what kind of business are you actually pursuing, right? And in some contexts, just 2 co-founders is sufficient because within the 2 of them, they have the right skill sets to want to cover the grounds for like the commercial business side of things, the product build in itself, the tech side of things, right? And then of course the domain expertise. And sometimes someone with a domain expertise actually has the commercial prowess or has a technical prowess. But at times the domain expert is an individual's like the profile in itself, right? So it really just depends. And so these are some of the things in which that we cover, right? In terms of finding the right co-founder, finding the right co-founding team. Because Antler is not going to sit there and tell you, Audrey, you need to team up with this and this person. We don't impose co-founders on each other. It's a personal decision to be made by the founders themselves. And it's also a consideration that the founders need to understand. Do I need X number of co-founders? What kind of co-founding backgrounds do I need for this type of startup, right? Like it's a very personal decision.
Yep. Some founders told me during the program, even three co-founders is difficult because it's like a triangle. You need to talk to when you have 3 siblings and then one fight and one can
mediate it.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's harder as well with 3. Some people think that way, but we wanted 4, so it's different perspective and people call us crazy. But anyways, coming back to this is that at the end of 10 weeks, you will invest in the founders who are actually have the founder fit, have the problem solution fit, or product market fit, we're not sure. But at least there's a very strong founder problem solution fit, right? So at first it was a scary experience for me. It was my first time pitching and all that stuff. So tell us, like, maybe there's like a specific sector or industry that you are looking to invest in, or how do you pick who to kind of invest in, or
Okay, so maybe I'll cover the first, right? Like in terms of, are there any specific sectors or industries that we're more excited about? Okay, so in a nutshell, Antler is sector agnostic, right? Because we really believe in the fact that it is a founder bet that we're taking. And so with the founder bet that we're taking, we have conviction that these founders know exactly what are the pain points in their respective industries that they've come from, right? So that's why we don't want to close ourselves off to be very thematized, or we're only investing in X kind of startups within, let's just say, manufacturing or healthcare only. We don't do that, right? At least not for now, at least. But this needs to be a hyper scalable kind of business, right? And so every VC will definitely see it from this lens. But for us, what that means is this needs to be a tech-enabled startup, because we don't invest in traditional setups like, for example, an agency model or like a brick and mortar or like a heavy capex kind of infrastructural businesses, because it can't achieve the kind of hyperscale growth that you would see with tech startups. And what does that mean, right? I know I'm using so many of these terminologies, but it means that when you're actually scaling up in terms of number of customers and revenue, you do not want your cost curve to also grow in tandem with your revenue, right? Because ideally, when you have a low capex, no capex kind of startup, essentially when you're scaling up, your cost kind of like starts stagnating at some point, right? Or at least it doesn't grow in tandem with your revenue. And that is usually like only capable or like only viable through tech enablement, because there's economies of scale at some point when you actually build out the infrastructure of the tech, and then essentially it's just scaling up, right? That's also why people talk about like building scalable architecture, because then it also keeps the cost down, right? So that's what we really emphasize on, as opposed to, hey, we're only looking at A, B, C sectors. But with that, we also are quite localized in a way, right? Because Antler is present across 29 locations worldwide. And depending on where the Antler cohort is, right, different regions, there might be different niches that particular region is known for. So for example, in Southeast Asia, agriculture is huge, manufacturing is huge, semicon is huge, right? So when there are founders who are actually building in those spaces, it definitely gets us very excited, because these are big industries and they are growing industries within this region. So we will definitely be opening up our eyes more when we actually like encounter founders who are coming in this space, wanting to build in this space, because we know that these are still very underserved sectors, right? And they're also big market share as well. And then apart from that, like for Antler Malaysia, because we are partnered up with Khazanah, so there's a lot of like national agenda that's actually driven by this. Not to say that we're only looking at those kinds of agendas, but it does help, because if these institutions are focusing on these types of themes or pillars, it means that it's also going to be easily leveraged by our portcos, right? Because we have that connection with the likes of Khazanah and these institutions, that we can help open up these conversations for our portcos, right? When they're already building, when they're actually like looking to speak to other customers. So I would say that is the kind of lens that we apply when we look at different types of startups building in what sector. But to cut it short, we are very open in terms of the different types of sectors. But there will be some sectors where we will question founders if they want to build within that space, because there's no inflection point, right? So not to say that, hey, we look at every sector, but if we know that that sector is a sun-setting sector, like what is the thing that's making it different now that you want to address it at this point in time? Yeah.
So for founders who are interested, but maybe their profile is not that strong in their space, what advice would you give to the founders to start building up before they actually wanting to venture into that specific space? Or maybe they are already in, for example, manufacturing all along, but what kind of skill sets that what advice would you give to them to actually build up the strength or resilience or whatever soft skills, or maybe their connections or networks, right, that can get them into venturing into a startup easier?
Right. Definitely, I would say this is predominantly coming for profiles where they don't have that many years of working experience yet, right? Like, so my advice here is to essentially expose yourself to a lot more different kinds of roles. Let's just say if you're in manufacturing and you've only like had like 2 years of experience within manufacturing, right? Try to explore as many different parts of the business within manufacturing. Like, build up your skill sets there, right? Like, build up your depth of experience in those areas, so that if really manufacturing is the sector that you want to be in, that you want to eventually build in, then I would say acquaint yourself across how the entire manufacturing industry works, right? And I would say, be it whether you want to jump different companies or like even within that same company, expose yourself to all of the different operations, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to solve for a particular problem in that space, you need to understand how the entire industry works, right? If you've only been someone who's done strategy like your entire career, even if it's in manufacturing, it doesn't expose you to a lot of the operational issues that exist, or a lot of like the implementation barriers that there might be, right? Like, so I mean, I've also come from strategy before, right? I'm not criticizing people who come from strategy. I think strategy is important, but it should not be the only lens that you are bringing to the table, because when you're in strategy, you're only seeing it from like a 35,000 feet lens. You don't understand the realities of what it takes to execute on a particular idea, on a particular project or initiative. That's why a lot of times, I don't know whether you've heard this saying, right? Like, strategy projects ends up dying a natural death. It's because when people strategize on things, they just come from like one perspective, and they never really hear like what is the problem of execution down the line, right? Because once strategy is devised, they just hand it over to another team, like, hey, now you go and implement this, right? So there's a real disconnect in terms of how strategies work versus how it's being executed, right? So that's like the first advice that I would give. Second, if you're someone who doesn't necessarily know, hey, I want to stick in a particular industry or a specific functionality, I still want to explore, then I would say definitely deepen your experience across different types of companies, right? Like, so for example, if you're someone who's like, I want to be known as like the operations person, expose yourself to operations across maybe multiple industries, right? Like, so it gives you a broad understanding of what might be the pain points that exist in operations in general, right? And experience from corporate to startups, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you only need to be with one type of employer.
I think that's a very great advice. I have a final question, sort of, and then after that we can sort of end this off. It's about, I think you, Antler, have adopted an AI process to interview candidates. So I think I kind of go through it because I am applying, sort of looking at the AI distro because I'm in the building AI startup. And I find it very interesting that the AI is actually interviewing me, and I can only use voice to talk to it. How is that coming along? Have Antler Malaysia also uses that?
We have. In fact, like, we've started using it since beginning of this year, right? I mean, of course, like, there are different reasons as to why we are using an AI interviewer in the process. I mean, efficiency is one more thing, but it's also another good way for us to suss out people who are more open to explore technologies, right? And how receptive they are to interacting and engaging with technologies. Because at the end of the day, we're investing in tech startups. So if people are, coming in, they're like, oh my God, I don't want to speak to an AI. I mean, it also kind of gives you an indication to the kind of personalities that they might have, the kind of tendencies that they might have. But of course, that's not the only reason why we won't, interview that person if they don't want to choose to go through the AI interviewer. But it definitely does give us an inkling as to how receptive are you to evolving technologies. And we need to walk the talk, right? I personally feel that AI is just a natural evolution of the tech stack, right? It's not so much of, oh, are you building an AI company or you're not building an AI company? I think at one point in very near future, everyone's going to have to be using AI in some shape or form to gain a competitive leverage, right? If there are companies that's not using AI in whatever that they're building, I will also start questioning as to why, right? And that's why my take is that this is just a natural evolution of the tech stack. And so by that perspective, that's also why Antler, as a VC that's investing in these types of companies, also needs to embrace technology in the same way, right? We also need to acquaint ourselves with how AI is evolving, how it's being used on the application layer side of things, not just the infrastructural layer side of things. Because then how are we keeping ourselves relevant to speaking to founders who are building in this space as well, right? So I feel like that's just a natural thing to do, because if you're going to assess people based on these things, you need to also be aware of what these things are.
I think it's really a cool concept or process that you have adopted there, and I'm very stoked about it actually, because I don't think many companies uses that, or basically in the HR space. They still doubt AI screening through CVs and candidates, So
I mean, definitely, right? Like, it's not perfect. I mean, we are not 100% just relying on it, because at the end of the day, this is just an engagement tool. And then we still have our team that's assessing the answers that these founders are having, how they're interacting with the AI bot, and then make an assessment whether this is a good fit or not, right? Like, we're literally listening through even the recordings. That's why we say, make sure that you use voice to interact with the AI interviewer, because that's also another way for us to assess the behavior and I guess like the characteristic of the candidate.
And you don't need to spend much time blocking out your calendar and speaking to this person, but you can actually already hear from him speaking to with the AI. That is really cool. Okay, coming to the last part. Just share when is the new batch of Antler program is starting, how can they apply, and basically talk about the program, and then we will end this session.
Sure. Thanks, Audrey. So our upcoming cohort is starting April 14th. So that's just like 3.5 weeks away from now. And we actually run 2 cohorts per year here in Malaysia. Typically, the first cohort of the year would land end of Q1, early Q2, so around this time period. And then the second cohort would be like end of September, early October, right? Like that would be the rough cadence that we see each year. And yeah, so in terms of applying, we basically have the online application form. You can just go to the Antler Malaysia website, and then effectively you can already see the CTA button there to apply. And typically, I would say the process takes anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks to get the candidate process through the first stage, because we do have a high volume of application that keeps coming in, and that volume keeps growing with every cohort that we have. And I guess that also speaks to the brand presence that we have here in Malaysia also. And it doesn't matter like where you're from, because we accept candidates from all over the world. Actually, in the Antler Malaysia cohort, we've had like 22 nationalities at one time, right? I mean, even the cohort that you were part of, Audrey, we had like, I think 17 different nationalities, and they're really cut from like many different regions. We've had Americans, Europeans, South Asians, Africans, obviously Southeast Asians as well, that has come to participate in the Malaysia cohort because they do see the benefit of being situated out of Malaysia for many different reasons, right? So yeah, I would say that this is really the place for you if you know that entrepreneurship is something that you want to either return to or start for yourself, regardless of whether you've come from corporate or startups. If you've already thought about it, bite the bullet, right? There's no such thing as a perfect time to jump into entrepreneurship because
agree.
It's like 95% like failure rate. So you need to be someone who's willing to take the risk, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's not for everyone either. So you need to assess for yourself whether this is the right path for you. But what I would say is that the Antler residency program is a means of de-risking that early stage entrepreneurship for people, for candidates like yourself, right? Like the founders, because we are providing the support, the facilitation, the help that you can need to sort of like overcome these like early stage problems. And then at the same time, it is also a de-risking process for us as investors, right? Because ultimately we are backing the founders. If we're going to take a bet on the founders, we need to understand what the founders are made of. The 10 weeks, the Antler team is actually working very closely with the founders. I think Audrey, you can speak to that, right?
Yeah.
And so that becomes a data point for us when considering, do we invest in these founders or not, right? So yeah.
Just to add on to that is that I have been thinking of jumping into entrepreneurship, but I've never really dared to develop my feet into it.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because there's no one to mentor me. Like I was feeling lost by myself, and I was just working corporate, and there's no one to exactly mentor me. So the first 4 weeks with the master classes, with the founder feature, different founders from different places coming over and give their thoughts, and you are interviewing them. And I think that really gave me a lot of insight of what it's like. And if you are thinking about entrepreneurship, I think you should join. And it's a place where you get mentorship, right? I think that's the best that I got out from it.
Yeah. And I mean, apart from mentorship, right, you can imagine the sort of new network that you create within the Antler cohort, right? Like
I was just in my own bubble and working every day, 9 to 5. And yeah, you don't have different perspective or people from different space who are building. It's just surprising to me that I meet an AI engineer who is my co-founder now, David. And yeah, it's just that different thing and ideas just spark like that.
Yeah. So that's definitely the beauty of being in here. And I personally believe that you are the average of the people around you. And I feel like if the average of the people around you in the cohort are all driven to want to build something meaningful and big, it will rub off on you to also think in the same way, right? Yeah. And also to be able to persevere because it's not as lonely ananymore.
Exactly. Yeah. That is the right word. Yes, thank you so much for joining me today, Najla.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. All right, I'll see you next time.